Hi guys. Imagine stepping back thousands of years into a world where the air smelled of smoke and honey, where the secrets of brewing were hidden in clay pots and whispered around flickering fires. Have you ever wondered what the very first beer tasted like? Or how our ancestors celebrated their victories, their harvests, their lives? Tonight, we not just talking about dusty ruins or broken pottery, we stepping into the heart of the Bronze Age, where brewing and feasting were more than survival. They were ritual, power, and magic. So, get comfortable, let curiosity guide you, and as always, dim the light, let the shadows grow soft, and sink into the story. In the ancient valleys, where rivers wound like silver snakes across fertile plains, villages thrived, each one marked by the rhythm of the seasons. Bronze Age people had mastered fire, metal, and farming. But perhaps their greatest invention was something more clay vessels with strange residues unearthed by archaeologists tell us of a golden liquid fermented with honey, barley, and herbs, crafted not only for thirst, but for ceremony. And at the center of this discovery stood the figure of the brewer, often a woman, who knew the secrets of grain, yeast, and time. She would soak barley until it sprouted, then dry it in the sun, grind it by hand on stone querns, and mix it with honey and herbs into a thick, sweet mash. The mixture bubbled, alive with wild yeast, transforming before their eyes into something intoxicating, something sacred. To drink was to connect with the land, with the gods, and with each other. Feasts in the Bronze Age were no ordinary meals. They were acts of unity and displays of power. A chieftain might summon his people after a victorious raid or a bountiful harvest, setting out great wooden tables laden with roasted meats, cheeses, grains, and of course, the prized brews. Imagine the sound, horns carved from animal bone blown to announce the gathering, the crackle of fires roasting boar, the laughter and songs echoing across a clearing. The brew was poured into heavy clay cups or shared from communal bowls, passed from hand to hand. Each sip was more than refreshment. It was a vow of loyalty, a bond of community. To refuse a drink was unthinkable, almost an insult. For it was through the feast that alliances were sealed, marriages arranged, and enemies forgiven. Archaeologists in sites like Egdbdd in Denmark and in burial mounds of Central Europe have discovered evidence of this ancient feasting culture. Residues of honey mead mixed with herbs like bog, myrtle, and yarrow were found in vessels placed with the dead, as though the afterlife, too, required the comfort of drink. Picture it, a young woman laid to rest in a woven wool dress, a small bucket-shaped vessel at her side, still carrying the trace of honey brew. Death was not an end, but a continuation, and the brew was her ticket to the great feast beyond. But feasts were not just about joy, they were also about power. Chieftains used them to demonstrate wealth, for only the strong could provide enough food and drink to satisfy the whole tribe. A man who could slaughter 10 cattle and fill great vats with brew was more than generous, he was untouchable. The more lavish the feast, the greater his prestige. And so, feasting became a form of currency, a way to rise in the ranks of society. The poor might brew in small clay jars, sipping in modest gatherings, but the powerful built their reputations in overflowing feasts that lasted for days. Imagine the scene at dusk, torches flickering against stone walls, shadows leaping across faces painted with ochre, dancers circling the fire as the drums beat steadily, each thump echoing the heartbeat of the crowd. In their hands, the people hold clay mugs brimming with foaming brew, its taste sharp with herbs and wildflowers. They sing songs of ancestors, of gods, of battles fought and won. A child watches wide-eyed, learning the rhythms of tradition, while an elder raises a cup to the heavens, spilling the first sip to the earth as an offering. In that moment, the feast becomes more than food, and drink it is ritual, binding together the living and the divine. The brewing itself was steeped in mystery, seen almost as magic. The bubbling of fermenting grain seemed alive, a miracle that turned plain barley and water into something that lifted spirits and softened hearts. Many believed it was the gods themselves who gifted this transformation. Myths whispered that the goddess of fertility had taught women to brew, and every successful fermentation was her blessing. To ruin a batch was not just wasteful, it was a sign of displeasure from the spirits. That is why feasting always began with offerings. A libation poured onto the soil, a prayer whispered to the sky, gratitude for the unseen forces that turned grain into golden drink. As the Bronze Age spread across Europe and the Near East, brewing traditions varied, but the essence remained the same. In Mesopotamia, brews were thick, sipped through reed straws from great communal jars. In Northern Europe, honey-based mead was cherished as the drink of gods. In the Mediterranean, herbs and spices flavored brews, each region leaving its own mark on the art of fermentation. Yet across cultures, the feast was universal, the moment when drink brought people together, dissolving barriers of wealth and power, if only for a night. Picture the dawn after such a feast, embers smoldering in the fire pits, the air heavy with the smell of ash and roasted meat, clay vessels lying empty, bodies sprawled across hides and furs, some still humming songs in half-sleep. A mother stirs awake, pulling her child close under a woolen blanket, while young warriors, heads heavy with drink, recall the boasts they made the night before. The feast had ended, but its memory lingered, weaving itself into the fabric of the tribe's identity. These gatherings shaped history in ways often overlooked. They were where leaders consolidated power, where communities healed after hardship, where myths and oral traditions were performed and passed down. Without feasting, without the brew that fueled it, the Bronze Age might have been a colder, lonelier time. Instead, through the warmth of shared cups and firelit songs, humanity found a rhythm of belonging. And so, when we hold a glass today, whether of beer, mead, or wine, we echo those ancient moments. We may no longer feast beneath the stars with drums and torches, but the instinct to gather, to celebrate, to drink in memory of the past remains within us. The Bronze Age may be long gone, but the spirit of brewing and feasting, of drink as ritual and community, still flows in our veins. The embers of the last feast had hardly cooled when the preparations for the next one began. For in the Bronze Age, the rhythm of life was measured by the gatherings that bound the people together. Across valleys and hills, tribes carried in their bones the understanding that feasting was not just an indulgence but a duty, a thread that stitched the community into one fabric. The land itself demanded gratitude, and brewing was the ritual language through which thanks were given. Women rose at dawn, carrying woven baskets of barley to the river's edge, soaking the grains until they swelled with life. They knew by instinct how long to let the seeds sprout before halting the growth, drying them near the warmth of fire or sunlight, then grinding them into coarse meal upon stone slabs. It was hard work, back-breaking at times, yet each action was done with reverence. for this was the foundation of the drink that would fuel the gathering. Honey was collected in clay jars, thick and golden, its sweetness both medicine and offering. Herbs were gathered from wild meadow zero heather, bog myrtle each, chosen for its power to flavor the brew and protect against unseen forces. These women were not merely cooks, they were keepers of knowledge, chemists without names, priests without altars, carrying forward secrets that had been whispered from mother to daughter for generations. As the vats bubbled, a scent of sweetness and earth drifted across the village, signaling what was to come. Children chased each other near the fires, too young to drink, but already learning the importance of the rituals. Young men sharpened bronze blades or polished axes, not because they expected to fight, but because feasting was also a display of strength and wealth. The stronger the warrior appeared, the more desirable he became in the eyes of potential brides. Marriage negotiations often began in the quiet corners of feasts, under the haze of brew and music. The elders, seated in honored places, observed everything with calm eyes, for their wisdom guided the delicate balance of alliance and rivalry. The brewing was not only about drink, it was about shaping the future of the tribe. When the feast began, the village transformed. Long wooden benches were dragged into open spaces, torches lit, fires stoked high until sparks danced into the night sky. Musicians tuned their instruments, simple drums, rattles, wooden pipes carved from bone or redanned. Soon the air pulsed with rhythm. The brew was carried in heavy jars, poured into cups carved from horn, clay, or even decorated bronze for the wealthy. The first sip was always offered to the gods, poured onto the earth, a silent plea that the next harvest would be just as generous. Then the cups were lifted, laughter erupted, and the feast surged forward like a river. Meat roasted on spits, fat sizzling as it dripped into the flames. Bread baked in clay ovens, its smell mingling with the smoke. Platters of fish, grains, and fruits circulated among the people. But it was the brew that held their attention, warming their bellies and loosening their tongues. Stories began to flow as freely as the drink. A warrior boasted of a raid on a distant village, describing how the enemy fled at the sight of his bronze-tipped spear. His comrades roared with laughter, though some quietly doubted the details. An elder sang a song of creation, voice trembling yet strong, reminding the people of their ancestors who had crossed mountains and rivers to settle these lands. Children leaned against their mother's eyes, heavy with sleep, but ears straining to catch the words. 4 stories were treasures passed along in the rhythm of night. Every tale told at the feast became part of the tribe's memory, a living library without books, etched into hearts instead of pages. As the night deepened, rituals grew more intense. Dancers circled the fire, stamping feet in patterns that echoed ancient rites. Painted bodies glistened with sweat, hair braided with feathers, eyes wide with ecstasy. Some wore masks shaped like animals, invoking the spirits of the hunt, leaping and growling as the crowd cheered. The brew added to the fervor, thinning the line between the human and the divine. For in that liminal state, when bellies were full and minds hazed, people felt the gods were nearest, hovering just beyond the veil of flame and shadow. Offerings of meat and bread were tossed into the fire, smoke rising as a messenger to the heavens. But not all feasts were peaceful. Sometimes old grudges surfaced under the influence of strong drink. A careless word, a boast too sharp, could spark heated arguments. Bronze daggers flashed in the firelight, voices rose, and the crowd would tense, waiting to see if blood would be spilled. Yet more often than not, elders or chieftains intervened, using the authority of age or wealth to restore calm. A cup would be passed, hands clasped in reconciliation, and the feast would continue. This too was part of the ritual. The brew could stir conflict, but it also provided the balm of forgiveness. The cycle of tension and resolution mirrored the cycle of the seasons: storm and calm, hunger and plenty, death and rebirth. Across the lands, each tribe left its own mark on feasting traditions. In the river valleys, people brewed lighter drinks, sweet and easy to consume in large quantities, perfect for day-long gatherings. In the northern forests, where honey was abundant, mead dominated, thick and golden, reserved for chieftains and warriors. In coastal villages, feasts often centered around seafood, with brews flavored by herbs unique to the salty air and marshlands. Though separated by distance, these communities shared the same heartbeat: the desire to gather, to drink, to bind themselves together through ritual celebration. Archaeological discoveries confirm this universality. Great feasting halls, some large enough to hold hundreds, have been unearthed, their post holes and hearths still visible in the earth. Inside, shards of pottery revealed traces of barley, honey, and herbs, silent witnesses, 2 nights of revelry long forgotten. The remains of animal bones, cracked open for marrow, tell of abundance, while bronze cauldrons, once filled with brew, gleam faintly even after millennia. These findings remind us that feasting was not the act of a few, but the lifeblood of entire cultures, pulsing through centuries of human experience. Imagine the silence after a feast ended, when the crowd dispersed and only the wind moved through the empty space. The torches extinguished, the fires reduced to ash, the laughter and music swallowed by the night. Yet in the hearts of those who had gathered, the warmth lingered. They carried it home, into their huts. The memory of shared food, shared drink, shared song bound them tighter than any chain of bronze. Even the conflicts that had flared seemed softer by morning, forgotten or forgiven in the haze of fellowship. The role of brewing extended beyond feasts. It was medicine for the sick, courage for the fearful, comfort for the grieving. In times of drought or famine, when bellies were empty and spirits low, a cup of brew was enough to remind people that joy was still possible, that life had not abandoned them. Women who brewed were respected for this gift, their knowledge valued as highly as a warrior's strength. Some believed they could influence fate itself through the mixtures they created, choosing herbs that calmed anger or stirred passion, that soothed pain or sparked visions. Brewing was chemistry, but it was also alchemy, transforming not just grain, but the human spirit. Even in death, brewing remained central. Feasts for the dead honored ancestors, ensuring their memory endured. Families would gather, pouring cups onto graves, believing the spirits drank alongside them. In burial mounds, vessels filled with traces of brew were placed beside the dead, provisions for the journey beyond. The act of sharing drink with the departed was not sorrowful, but celebratory, a reminder that the bonds of community extended beyond the veil of mortality. Through centuries, the art of Bronze Age brewing and feasting evolved, but its essence remained: to gather, to honor, to connect. In every sip, people tasted not only grain and honey, but the soul of their community, the heartbeat of their ancestors. And though empires would rise and fall, though languages and customs would change, the instinct to lift a cup in celebration, to gather around food and fire, endured. It is a tradition older than history itself, written not in ink but in laughter, song, and the golden glow of brew shared under the stars. The feast fires flickered across the hills, their smoke rising like silent beacons into the night sky, visible from miles away. Travelers approaching the village could smell it long before they arrived, the unmistakable blend of roasted meat, honeyed brew, and damp earth warmed by flames. Feasts in the Bronze Age were not hidden affairs. They were meant to announce themselves to the world. For each crackling fire and drumbeat told a story. This community is strong. This chieftain is generous. These people are united. No stranger could mistake the meaning, and no ally could resist the invitation. Hospitality was a sacred law, and the feast hall became the place where outsiders were welcomed, tested, and absorbed into the tribe's fabric. When guests arrived from distant settlements, they were greeted first with a cup of brew, for drink was the threshold of belonging. To take the cup was to step across into fellowship. To refuse it was to remain apart, perhaps even to show hostility. The taste varied from village to village, sometimes sharp with herbs, sometimes mellow with honey, but the meaning was universal. A man who drank from another's cup became part of his household, if only for a night. And so, feasting became diplomacy, a stage where bonds were formed without parchment or seals, only the raised hand and the shared bowl. Within the feast, power displayed itself in subtle ways. The chieftain sat at the center, his place unmistakable, a great vessel of brew at his right hand. Around him, his warriors gathered close, their bronze ornaments gleaming in the firelight, weapons laid nearby not for use but as symbols of readiness. The farther one sat from the center, the less influence one held. Yet even the humblest villager was given a place, for exclusion was dangerous. The feast was about unity as much as hierarchy. Musicians knew this well, pacing their songs to match the ebb and flow of energy in the crowd, lifting spirits when silence threatened, softening tempers when anger rose. The drumbeat stitched the people together as tightly as the brew. Children learned by watching. They saw how elders poured the first libations, how warriors boasted, but also yielded in games of strength, how women exchanged knowing glances when matches were quietly discussed for future marriages. The feast was not just about the present moment. It was an education in the language of community. A boy who carried water or wood to the fire might one day sit at the chieftain's side. A girl who helped serve bread might grow to oversee brewing for the entire village. Every role had meaning, and every act built the foundation of the tribe's future. As the night deepened, competitions often took place. Wrestling matches between young men drew cheers, the victor's strength a promise of protection for the tribe. Archery contests were staged with torches marking distant targets, arrows hissing into the dark to prove skill. Even drinking itself became a contest, with warriors attempting to outlast one another, their laughter booming until they slumped onto hides in exhaustion. These games were more than entertainment. They were rehearsals for war, demonstrations of endurance, and public affirmations of loyalty. A man who competed was saying to his people, "I will stand with you when the time comes." Yet not all contests were physical. Storytelling was its own form of competition. Elders, bards, and wandering singers vied for attention with tales of ancestors, gods, and battles. The crowd judged not only the tale itself, but the voice, the rhythm, the power to weave an image so vivid that listeners could almost see the gods stepping from the shadows. A great storyteller could wield as much influence as a warrior, for words shaped memory, and memory shaped destiny. Brew fueled these performances, loosening tongues, sharpening wit, allowing imagination to soar. There were darker undertones, too. Feasting could be a stage for testing loyalty. A chieftain might deliberately seat rivals near one another, watching to see if old animosities flared or were buried. A warrior suspected of disloyalty might be pressed to drink, toasting his leader in front of all, so that refusal would expose him. Gifts were exchanged, sometimes lavishly ornaments of bronze, fine woven textiles, even livestock hand. With each gift came obligation. The more one received, the more one owed, and the feast bound these invisible debts tighter than any chain. Women moved through the crowd with confidence, carrying vessels, offering bread, sometimes joining in the songs and dances. Their role in brewing gave them authority, for without their labor and knowledge, the feast could not exist. In some tribes, they sang special songs as they poured, invoking blessings on those who drank. Some whispered charms over the vats as they stirred, blending ritual into the very liquid itself. To the people, there was no difference between practical brewing and sacred brewing. It was all one act, linking survival with spirit. At the edges of the firelight, shadows deepened, and it was here that myths took shape. People spoke of spirits drawn by the smoke, of ancestors standing unseen among them, watching, listening. When the flames crackled and sparks leaped high, some swore they saw figures in the glow shapes of hunters long dead, gods in animal forms, warnings from unseen worlds. The brew heightened these visions, loosening the boundary between reality and imagination. Children trembled, but also leaned closer, wide-eyed, for to glimpse a spirit, even in fear, was to feel the weight of tradition pressing close. As dawn approached, the feast slowed, but did not end. Some still sang, voices hoarse, while others lay curled in sleep, the firelight soft on their faces. The chieftain, weary yet satisfied, knew the feast had done its work. His people were bound together for another season, their loyalty reaffirmed, their spirits renewed. The empty vessels, the gnawed bones, the trampled earthfall bore witness to the abundance he had provided. His prestige would carry through winter and into the next campaign or harvest. The feast was both memory and promise, echoing long after the fires died. The days that followed were quieter, but no less important. People recounted the feast in fragments, the story that made them laugh, the boast that made them cheer, the moment they saw their gods in the flames. Memory kept the feast alive, and each retelling added to the legend. Children acted out the dances, pretending to hold mugs of brew. Women planned the next brewing, exchanging herbs and seeds, experimenting with new flavors. Warriors remembered the contests, boasting of victories, or vowing to do better next time. Life resumed, but it carried the glow of the gathering like embers under ash, ready to flare again. Over centuries, as bronze gave way to iron and tribes grew into kingdoms, the traditions of brewing and feasting only deepened. Great halls rose, supported by massive timbers, their walls hung with woven tapestries. Fires roared in stone hearths, and cauldrons the size of a man bubbled with brew. Yet even in these grander settings, the essence remained unchanged. The cup was still lifted, first to the gods. The people still gathered to sing, boast, and remember, and the bond between drink and fellowship endured. Archaeology shows us this continuity: fragments of cauldrons, decorated cups, bones scattered from feasts centuries apart, all telling the same story. humanity's hunger for togetherness and ritual never wavered. Even as trade expanded, bringing new flavor spices from the south, fruits from distant lands' villages still cherished their own brews. A traveler might carry exotic drink to impress a chieftain, but it was the familiar taste of honey and barley that stirred the deepest pride. To drink the brew of one's ancestors was to drink one's identity, to taste the soil beneath one's feet. The feast was not only about food and drink, it was about belonging, about affirming the unbroken chain that linked each generation to the last. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, when we raise a glass at a wedding, a festival, or even a simple dinner among friends, we are not merely echoing tradition, we are continuing it. The Bronze Age feasts may have ended, their fires long cold, but their spirit burns on in every toast, every shared meal, every story told over drink. For in the end, humanity has always known that survival is not enough. We need ritual, we need community, we need the warmth of feasts and the golden flow of brew to remind us that life is not only endured but celebrated. The last embers of countless feasts had long since faded into the soil, yet their spirit lingered, woven into the very fabric of Bronze Age life. Villages measured their prosperity not only in cattle or grain, but in the memory of how often their fires lit the night sky with celebration. A feast was more than food, and drink it was legacy. It was proof that life had been wrestled from the earth and transformed into abundance. In the lull between harvests, as winter winds clawed at the thatch of huts, people spoke of past feasts to keep their hearts warm, remembering the taste of honey brew and the songs that had lifted them above hunger and fear. In those stories, the dead feasted alongside the living, and so no celebration was ever truly gone. The act of brewing remained at the heart of this rhythm, an endless cycle of grains sprouting, drying, grinding, mixing, fermenting, and pouring. Each stage held meaning, and each demanded care. To mishandle the grain was to risk hunger, to misjudge the fermentation was to insult the gods. Skilled brewers carried an aura of power, for they balanced on the line between the practical and the sacred. When the bubbling of the vats grew strong, villagers leaned in, hearing in the hiss and froth the whispers of unseen forces. They believed the gods breathed within the brew, and when it foamed, it was the laughter of spirits filling the air. Great feasts were often timed with celestial events. At solstices, when the sun lingered longest or fled shortest across the horizon, fires blazed high and cauldrons overflowed. People marked these moments as thresholds between seasons, times when the veil between worlds was thin. They drank not only for themselves, but for their ancestors, their descendants, the gods above and the spirits below. In some villages, wooden poles carved with symbols were raised in the center of the feast, garlanded with flowers or hides, a focal point around which dancers circled. In others, great stones stood as silent witnesses, aligned with the path of the sun or stars, turning the feast into a cosmic ritual. Archaeologists, centuries later, uncovered fragments of these gatherings, scorched pits filled with animal bones, pollen grains preserved in the soil, residues of mead clinging to clay. Each fragment whispered of nights when hundreds gathered, voices raised in unison, lives woven together by the simple act of drinking. It is easy to imagine the heat of bodies pressed close, the shimmer of bronze ornaments, the pounding of drums, echoing against distant hills. Each feast was both fleeting and eternal, vanishing by morning, but living forever in memory. Power was displayed most vividly in the scale of these feasts. A chieftain who could slaughter entire herds and brew enough to fill massive bronze cauldrons proved his dominance not by force of arms alone, but by generosity. His wealth became visible in the bellies of his people, in the drunken songs that carried his name. For warriors, loyalty was rewarded, not only with spoils from raids, but with places of honor at the feasting bench. The more a man ate and drank at his lord's table, the more bound he became, not by chains, but by gratitude and expectation. These were debts of honor, harder to break than any oath sworn in silence. Yet the feast was never only about men of power. Women shaped its course in ways that were both visible and hidden. Their hands brewed the drink, their voices guided the songs, their wisdom kept balance when tempers flared. In some traditions, women led the rituals that blessed the brew, chanting prayers as they stirred the vats. In others, they composed the laments and praises sung during the feast, ensuring that memory flowed like liquid through the generations. A feast without women was unthinkable. Their absence would have left the brew flat, the songs hollow, the community incomplete. The feasting grounds themselves became sacred. Over time, certain places were chosen again and again, until their soil was thick with ash and bone, their air heavy with memory. Returning to these sites was like entering a temple, even though no walls were raised. Each new feast added a layer of meaning, binding past to present. Children born during one gathering might return decades later to lead another, drinking from the same ground their parents once blessed. In this way, the land itself became an archive of memory, recording in silence what no parchment yet could. As centuries passed, brewing grew more complex. Trade brought new ingredients: figs, dates, spices that altered the taste of the brew. Techniques improved, vessels grew larger, fires burned hotter. Yet despite these changes, the essence remained the same. To brew was to honor the cycle of life. To feast was to bind the tribe together. No amount of innovation could alter the fact that the simplest mixture of grain, water, and honey carried within it the power to unite hearts. There were darker feasts, tuthos, held in times of mourning. When a great leader died, his passing was marked with days of ritual. The dead were laid upon wooden platforms or within earthen mounds, surrounded by offerings of weapons, ornaments, and vessels filled with brew. Mourners gathered not only to weep, but to drink, to tell stories of the departed, to ensure his memory was woven into the living fabric of the tribe. In some traditions, entire cattle were slaughtered, their hides draped over burial sites, their meat shared among the mourners. Even in death, the feast affirmed continuity. The community endured because it gathered, because it drank, because it remembered. Feasts were also times of storytelling, and these tales became as nourishing as the food itself. Around the fire, voices rose to recount not just recent events, but myths of gods and heroes, ancestors who had crossed seas or battled monsters. Children drifted to sleep with these stories in their ears, dreaming of mighty deeds. The brew loosened tongues, allowing storytellers to reach higher flights of imagination, blending history and myth into seamless fabric. What mattered was not factual detail, but the way the story bound listeners together, giving them a shared past to believe in. The echoes of Bronze Age brewing and feasting ripple forward into our present. When archaeologists taste reconstructed brews, they do more than sample ancient recipes. They sip from the same current of tradition that once bound entire communities. Modern festivals, where people gather to drink, sing, and dance, may use electric lights and amplified music, but the instinct is the same. We crave the warmth of shared cups, the safety of firelit laughter, the rhythm of drums or song binding us as one. Our ancestors discovered that survival was sweeter when celebrated, and that truth has never left us. Imagine now one last great Bronze Age feast, the fires blazing against a dark horizon, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and honeyed brew. Warriors sit shoulder to shoulder, their bronze ornaments gleaming. Women move gracefully with vessels, their songs weaving through the crowd. Children laugh, elders speak, drums pound, dancers leap in masks of beasts and birds. A chieftain lifts his cup, pouring the first sip to the earth, calling on gods and ancestors to bless his people. The crowd answers with a roar, and cups are raised in unison. The brew foams, the firelight flickers, and for one timeless night, hunger and fear are banished. In their place is only abundance, fellowship, and the unshakable certainty that life, though fragile, is worth celebrating. When dawn comes, the fires smolder, the vessels lie empty, and the people return to their daily toil. Yet the memory remains, shining in their hearts, like embers that never die. It is in those memories that their strength endures, generation after generation, carried forward until it reaches us. For when we gather today, when we raise a glass in celebration or remembrance, we echo those ancient nights. We join hands across time with the brewers and feasters of the Bronze Age, sharing in the same eternal truth that to live is to gather, to drink, to feast, and to remember. And so, though the Bronze Age has long since ended, its spirit survives wherever people come together in joy. The brew may taste different, the songs may carry new words, the fires may be built with modern hands, but the essence is unchanged. Humanity has always needed more than food for survival. It has needed the feast, the ritual of togetherness, the golden flow that turns hunger into celebration. Across centuries, across continents, the story remains the same. We raise our cups not only to quench our thirst, but to honor the unbroken chain of life, binding us to those who came before and those yet to come. In that simple act, we become one with the people of the Bronze Age, with their fires, their songs, their laughter in the night, and the feast continues, eternal. They carved their lives into the waves, their homes not bound by earth, but by the endless pull of the horizon. For them, the sea was no barrier. It was a road stretching farther than any path across the land. Long before maps were drawn, before compasses pointed north, the ancient seafaring peoples lifted their eyes to the stars and let the constellations guide them into the unknown. They built vessels from what they had hollowed logs lashed together, reeds bound tight, planks stitched with cordon. With these fragile crafts, they crossed distances that even modern minds marvel at. Their courage was born not of recklessness, but of necessity, for the sea promised fish when the land gave none shells, when the soil turned barren, and a horizon full of trade and conquest, when fields could no longer hold growing populations. The first daring voyages were small, skimming across rivers and hugging the coastlines. But each success fed ambition, and soon they sailed farther, learning how winds shifted with the seasons, and how currents pulled like hidden rivers through the open ocean. Their senses sharpened into tools. They read the swell of waves, the flight of seabirds, the smell of salt and seaweed on the air. What seemed chaos to outsiders was for them a language, and in mastering it, they unlocked the world. One can picture them gathering at dawn, lifting their vessels into the surf, the rhythmic chant of rowers blending with the crash of waves, the the chiefs or elders would pour offerings of oil or wine into the water, pleading with sea gods for mercy. In Mesopotamia, stories tell of Oannes, a being who rose from the waves to teach humanity the arts of civilization, reminding sailors that knowledge itself flowed from the ocean. In Egypt, the Nile birthed fleets that ventured into the Mediterranean, their sails catching the desert winds, carrying grain, gold, and papyrus to distant shores. The Minoans of Crete turned their island into the hub of a maritime empire, their ships dancing across the Aegean like shoals of fish, bearing olive oil, wine, and finely crafted pottery. To be a seafaring people was to be both vulnerable and powerful, exposed to storms, yet able to strike suddenly across distant coasts. Pirates and traders were often one and the same, their reputations shifting like the tide. The sea connected cultures, but it also carried danger. Raiders known as the Sea Peoples descended upon the coasts of Egypt and the Levant during the Late Bronze Age. Their ships fast and lethal, their warriors armed with curved swords and horned helmets. Entire kingdoms trembled at the sight of sails on the horizon, for they knew the balance of land power meant little against those who mastered the waves. To rule the sea was to control the arteries of trade, and trade was the lifeblood of civilization. Tin from distant mines mixed with copper to make bronze. Amber traveled from northern forests. Spices whispered of lands barely imagined. Ships carried not only goods, but ideas, myths, and languages. A sailor from one shore could bring songs to another, and those songs might carry gods with them. Thus, pantheons blended, and myths traveled faster than armies ever could. Daily life aboard the vessels was brutal. The sun beat down, waves soaked clothes, provisions rotted, and thirst gnawed at men's throats. Yet camaraderie was forged in hardship. Stories were told under the stars, jokes traded to lighten the gloom, prayers muttered in moments of terror. They watched the heavens closely. The North Star gave orientation, and in the tropics, rising constellations marked the turning of seasons. Polynesians later perfected this celestial navigation, crossing thousands of miles of Pacific with nothing but canoes and memory. They read the color of the water, the way clouds gathered over unseen islands, the drift of floating debris. These methods were ancient, shared across generations, not in books but in songs, chants, and sacred ritual. To be a navigator was to carry the tribe's survival on one's shoulders, for one wrong decision meant endless death in the horizon's emptiness. Festivals on land often celebrated the sea's bounty. In Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon, sailors returned with holds heavy with purple dye made from murex shells, so precious it clothed kings. Crowds gathered as ships docked, unloading lumber from cedar forests, silver, and rare glass. These goods bought power and influence, allowing coastal cities to grow into wealthy hubs of culture and innovation. Their alphabets spread with their trade, simple symbols that merchants used to tally goods, eventually becoming the foundation of written languages across the Mediterranean. Here, the sea was not merely livelihood, it was the engine of civilization itself. But the sea demanded sacrifices. Storms rose without warning, tearing sails to ribbons, smashing holes against unseen rocks. Whole crews vanished into the deep, their names only remembered in mourning songs. Many peoples personified the sea as a hungry god, insatiable in appetite. Offerings of livestock, wine, or even human lives were given to appease this deity. When storms cleared and survivors staggered back to shore, they were treated as both cursed and blessed, cursed for witnessing the sea's fury, blessed for escaping its jaws. These rituals gave meaning to what seemed random, a way of framing the terror in terms human minds could endure. Children of seafaring families grew up with salt in their blood. They played at rowing, carved toy boats, and listened to elders' tales of distant lands where rivers ran with gold or mountains smoked fire. They learned early that the ocean was both friend and enemy. Some villages marked coming of age with voyages. Boys were sent across narrow straits or out to nearby islands, returning as men. Girls, too, played roles in maritime cultures, weaving sails, preparing provisions, singing chants that were believed to steady the waves. Whole communities existed in rhythm with the sea, their festivals aligned with tides, their gods rising from the foam. The allure of discovery was irresistible. Beyond survival or trade, seafarers felt the pull of horizons themselves. Curiosity drove them into dangerous waters. The first to sight an unknown island became part of legend, his or her name passed down in chants. The island itself gained mythic stature. Some were said to be guarded by spirits, others rich with resources. Colonization followed exploration. Seafaring peoples spread cultures far and wide, planting their languages, crops, and customs in distant soils. The Greeks later remembered Jason and his Argonauts, a myth that echoed the bravery of countless real expeditions undertaken in fragile ships centuries earlier. The sea was also a battlefield. Naval warfare emerged when oared galleys rammed one another, their bronze-tipped prows splintering wood, warriors leaping aboard in chaotic malaise. Victory at sea meant dominance not only of coastlines but of whole regions. Control of sea routes meant controlling who could eat, who could trade, who could grow. Thus, alliances and empires rose and fell with the tides. The very balance of history hinged not only on armies marching across land, but on ships cutting through waves. At night, when the world quieted, seafarers gazed at the horizon and felt something deeper than commerce or conquest. The sea stretched into infinity, mirroring the mysteries of existence itself. Its ceaseless waves spoke of eternity, its hidden depths of secrets beyond human grasp. Poets and priests alike turned to the ocean as metaphor, drawing inspiration from its moods. It became a symbol of chaos and creation, destruction and rebirth. For the peoples who lived with it daily, the sea was life distilled into its most primal form, unpredictable, immense, and always calling them forward. And so the legacy of these ancient seafaring peoples was not just their voyages, but the mindset they left behind. They showed that boundaries could be crossed, that risks could yield wonders, that the world was larger than the eye could see. They bound humanity together across distances, proving that even in ages of bronze and red, courage could transform the impossible into reality. Their ships may have rotted, their sails torn, their bones long buried beneath sand and sea, but their influence survives in every harbor city, every trade route, every story of discovery that still fuels the human heart. The memory of the first voyages lingered long after their sails vanished on the horizon, woven into the fabric of cultures that built their lives on water. From the storm-tossed shores of the North Sea to the calm lagoons of the Pacific, humanity's story bent and curved with the currents. Ancient seafarers were more than traders or raiders. They were the architects of connections that made isolated worlds into parts of a greater whole. The sea was the great equalizer, erasing borders and drawing people into its network of winds and waves. A place where survival depended less on walls or armies, and more on the ability to read the sky and bend with the storm. Their vessels, primitive by modern standards, were masterpieces of adaptation, each shaped by the environment that birthed it. In the Baltic, heavy boats of pine carved through choppy waters. In Egypt, red boats skimmed the Nile before braving the Mediterranean. In Oceania, double-hulled canoes stretched across open expanses of the Pacific. Each design carried the DNA of innovation, every plank and lash a response to the demands of wind, tide, and survival. As time passed, the horizon ceased to be the limit of imagination. It became the lure itself. Myths arose of lands beyond the Sunset Islands, where immortality dwelled, continents of endless wealth. These myths, part cautionary tale and part dream, spurred sailors to test their limits. The Phoenicians, daring masters of the Mediterranean, sailed not only across familiar seas, but perhaps even circumnavigated Africa under the commission of Pharaoh Necho II. Their purple-dyed sails and keen mercantile instincts transformed them into carriers of both goods and culture, spreading an alphabet that would eventually shape global communication. Wherever their keels touched shore, they left behind fragments of themselves, a coin, a shard of pottery, a word borrowed into local speech. In this way, the sea became the bloodstream of civilization, carrying fragments of one culture into the veins of another, until identities blurred and expanded. The Norsemen, centuries later, would carry the same restless spirit into the cold Atlantic. Their dragon-prowed longships, slicing through icy waves, reaching as far as Iceland, Greenland, and even the coasts of North America. Yet, long before them, smaller, quieter peoples had already challenged the ocean. The Austronesians pushed outward from Taiwan and the Philippines into the vast Pacific. Their outrigger canoes carving paths to Polynesia, Micronesia, and Madagascar. This was not the work of accident, but of methodical, generational expansion, guided by navigational traditions so complex that they rivaled later instruments of science. Knowledge was encoded into chants and constellations, into the remembered shape of swells and the shadows of clouds that hinted at unseen islands. Entire societies were organized around this ability. For those who mastered the sea carried power greater than warriors with spears. They carried the power to move entire peoples across the globe. Seafaring was as much about exchange as it was about conquest. Along the trade routes, ideas traveled like contraband hidden in cargo. Religion shifted with the tide. Gods, once tied to local rivers, found new homes on distant coasts, altered yet familiar. The goddess Astarte of Phoenicia found echoes in Greek Aphrodite. Egyptian deities journeyed northward with sailors and were reshaped into forms that fit new pantheons. Languages carried words like gifts, embedding foreign syllables into local speech, until tongues themselves bore the fingerprints of the sea. Even diets changed. Olives and wine spread through the Mediterranean because ships carried not just the harvest, but the cultural prestige of consuming them. To drink wine in a northern land was to taste the sun of southern shores, a sip of connection to distant empires. But with connection came conflict. The same routes that carried trade also carried raiders, pirates, and armies. The The sea peoples of the Bronze Age left scars across the Levant, their raids so devastating they helped topple kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Later, Carthaginian fleets clashed with Roman galleys for supremacy of the Mediterranean, battles where the fate of nations hinged on the creak of oars and the crash of boarding planks. The sea was never neutral. It was a battlefield as much as a marketplace, a shifting stage upon which empires gambled their futures. For sailors themselves, these struggles translated into blood and toil, the roar of waves drowned only by the screams of war. Yet even in conflict, innovation thrived: better hulls, stronger sails, new tactics of ramming or boarding. Necessity drove invention, and invention fueled the expansion of seafaring cultures. Life at sea demanded resilience. Months aboard a vessel tested the limits of endurance. Food spoiled quickly. Fresh water turned stale. Sickness spread with merciless speed. Rats gnawed at ropes and stores. Storms battered hulls until timbers groaned like living things. Yet sailors adapted. They learned to preserve fish with salt, to ration supplies, to repair sails mid-storm. Rituals filled the void where control failed. Songs were sung to steady the oars, prayers whispered to calm the swells. Superstitions multiplied: never whistle on deck, lest you summon winds to fierce. Never set sail on unlucky days. Never killed the seabirds that circled overhead, for they carried the souls of lost sailors. These beliefs bound crews together, giving them a shared language of survival in the face of nature's indifference. Communities ashore pulsed with anticipation for returning fleets. Harbors filled with the smells of tar and fish, with the sounds of hammering as ships were repaired or built anew. Markets thrived on imported goods, their stalls glittering with trinkets from far-off lands. Children listened, wide-eyed, to sailors' tales of monstrous waves, distant temples, and cities rising from the sea. These stories grew with each telling until myth and reality blurred. Did sailors truly see islands of fire belching smoke into the sky? Or were they describing volcanoes glimpsed from afar? Did they battle sea serpents, or only the shadows of whales rising from the deep? The truth mattered less than the awe. Such stories inspired, for they reminded listeners of the immensity of the world beyond their shores. Death at sea was common, and yet it was honored. When a sailor was lost to the waves, families believed the sea itself had claimed him, taking him into its eternal depths. Funerary rites often involved libations poured into the surf, songs sung into the wind, or offerings cast into the tide. The sea was both grave and god, both destroyer and giver of life. Entire mythologies sprang from this duality. In Greece, Poseidon's trident shook the seas, while in Polynesia, Tangaroa reigned as the god of the ocean's depths. Across cultures, the sea became a divine mirror, reflecting humanity's own contradictions, nurturing yet merciless, predictable yet wild, familiar yet infinite. The ancient seafaring peoples, though separated by thousands of miles, shared this intimate understanding of the ocean. They were united not by blood or language, but by the common rhythm of tide and wind. They understood that to master the sea was never to conquer it, but to dance with it, to surrender to its patterns, and find strength in harmony. Their legacy is not measured solely in the distances they crossed, or the cargoes they carried, but in the mindset they left behind. A restless hunger for what lay beyond, a faith that courage could carry fragile vessels into the unknown and return them home again. Today, Modern ships with steel hulls and digital navigation systems trace routes first pioneered by these ancient sailors. Cargo containers replace amphorae, and satellites replace stars, yet the essence remains unchanged. We still rely on the sea to bind the world together, to carry goods and ideas, to remind us that no culture exists in isolation. And though much of the ocean has been mapped, the mystery endures. Each time a vessel slips beyond the horizon, it reenacts the oldest story. Humanity knows the story of leaving safety behind and trusting the sea to carry us forward. The ancient seafaring peoples are gone, their boats rotted into silt, their harbors buried beneath sand, their songs reduced to fragments. Yet their spirit lingers in every shoreline city, every trade route, every tale of discovery whispered by waves against stone. They proved that the horizon was not an end, but a beginning, that the sea could knit the world together long before roads or empires claimed to do the same. In their courage and their curiosity lies the seed of every voyage humanity has ever taken, from reed boats crossing narrow straits to rockets piercing the blackness of space. For just as they once looked at the horizon and saw possibility, so too do we look upward and feel the same ancient call. Beyond lies another world, and we must go to meet it.